The morning they brought Silas Wainwright's body back to the ranch draped over his own saddle, Harriet Wainwright did not weep, and it was that dry-eyed silence that told the men of Prairie Rose more about her marriage than any words could have. It was the spring of 1878, and the wind off the Sweetwater River carried the smell of sage and wet earth across the Wyoming Territory grassland. Sheriff Cole Bannister removed his hat as he led the horse into the yard, and behind him rode two ranch hands who would not meet Harriet's eyes. She stood on the porch of the house Silas had built 5 years before, her hands folded over her apron, and she watched the horse come to a stop before she allowed herself to move. "Ma'am," Sheriff Bannister said, his voice low and careful, as though he expected her to break apart right there in the dust. "We found him out past Dunmore's north fence line. Looks like whoever he was riding with turned on him." There was a running iron in his saddlebag, and about 30 head of cattle scattered wearing brands that did not belong to him. Harriet felt the words settle into her like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples she could not stop. She had known, in the quiet places of her heart where a wife keeps the truths she cannot speak aloud, that Silas rode with men who were not honest. She had seen the unbranded calves appear in the north pasture in the dead of night. She had heard him come home smelling of gunpowder and dust when he claimed to have been trading in Cheyenne. She had asked no questions because a woman without family or means in the territory learned quickly that some questions were better left buried, like seeds that would only choke the garden if she dug them up. "Thank you, Sheriff," she said, and her voice did not shake, though her hands trembled where they were hidden in her apron. "I will see to his burial. There is one more thing, Mrs. Wainwright." Bannister's jaw tightened. "This land your husband built on. I do not know how much you know of its history, but there is a man coming back to the territory who has a claim on it older than Silas's deed. I thought you ought to hear that from me before you hear it from someone less kind." Harriet's stomach turned cold, though she kept her spine straight the way her mother had taught her back in Missouri, before the fever took both her parents and left her to make her own way in the world at 16. "What man?" "Name is Jeremiah Turner," the sheriff said. "His family homesteaded this ground 8 years back before your husband ever came to the territory. There was trouble. Cattle went missing, a barn burned, and old Thomas Turner ended up selling out for a fraction of what the land was worth, to a buyer nobody ever saw face to face. It was your husband's money, ma'am, even if his name was not on the first papers. Folks always suspected it, but nobody could prove it, and Thomas Turner died 2 winters back in Cheyenne, still swearing he had been robbed rather than bought out fair." Harriet's mouth went dry. She looked past the sheriff to the rolling hills where her cattle grazed, hills she had come to love despite everything, hills where she had buried a stillborn child 2 years into her marriage, and had gone out alone at dawn ever since to lay wildflowers on the small stone marker. This land, which she had scrubbed and planted and wept over, had never truly been her husband's to give her. It had been stolen from a family who had lost everything to build it. "I did not know," she said quietly, and it was the truth, though she understood even as she said it that the truth would not matter to a man who had lost his home. "I believe you," Bannister said. "But Jeremiah Turner does not know you yet, Mrs. Wainwright. And when a man has waited 8 years to come back for what was taken from him, he does not always arrive in a forgiving mood." They buried Silas Wainwright 2 days later on a low rise behind the house, beneath a lone cottonwood tree, with only Harriet, the sheriff, and the 2 ranch hands in attendance. No preacher could be found on short notice, so Bannister read a few lines from a worn Bible he kept in his saddlebag, and Harriet stood with her chin lifted and her eyes dry, and told herself that whatever grief she carried, it was grief for what her marriage might have been rather than what it had been. She was 26 years old, and she owned, on paper, 400 acres of grassland along the Sweetwater River, a small herd of cattle of uncertain and dangerous origin, a house with a leaking roof, and a debt at the Prairie Rose Bank that she had not known existed until Silas's death forced the ledgers into the light. She had nowhere else to go. Her parents were long dead, she had no brothers or sisters, and the only family she had known these past 5 years lay in the ground beneath the cottonwood tree, a man she had never fully understood and now never would. She decided, standing there with the wind pulling at her skirts, that she would not leave. Whatever Silas Wainwright had done to claim this ground, she had scrubbed its floors and planted its garden and lost a child beneath its sky. She would not be run off it by grief, by debt, or by a stranger's old grievance, no matter how just that grievance might be. She did not yet know that the stranger was already 3 days' ride away, following the North Platte toward the Sweetwater, carrying a leather satchel with a faded deed inside it, and a heart hardened by 8 years of loss he intended to collect in full. Jeremiah Turner had left the Wyoming Territory in the autumn of 1870, an 18-year-old boy leading his weeping mother and broken father toward Cheyenne, with nothing but 2 wagons, a dozen head of cattle, and a bitterness that had settled into his chest like a stone that would not dissolve. He remembered every detail of the ranch they left behind, though he had spent 8 years trying to forget it. The bend in the river where he had learned to fish, the barn his father had raised with the help of neighbors long since scattered to the winds, the low hill where his younger sister was buried after the diphtheria took her the year before they lost everything else. He had worked as a drover on the long cattle drives from Texas to the railheads in Kansas, had broken horses in Colorado, had spent 2 hard winters trapping in the Bighorn Mountains, and through all of it, he had saved every dollar he could toward one purpose, proving that Thomas Turner had been swindled out of his land and taking it back. It had not been difficult to learn the truth, once he started asking the right questions of the right people. A land office clerk in Cheyenne, retired now and willing to talk for the price of a bottle of whiskey, remembered the transaction well. The buyer had used an agent, a quiet man who paid cash and never gave his true name, but the clerk recalled that the funds had been drawn against an account belonging to one Silas Wainwright, a cattleman new to the territory who had a reputation, even then, for keeping unusual company. Jeremiah had also found 2 former ranch hands, brothers named Cobb, who swore under oath before a notary in Cheyenne that they had seen riders in the night driving Thomas Turner's cattle off toward a canyon known to hide rustled stock, riders they later recognized as men who rode with Wainwright. It was not enough, perhaps, to hang a man in a court of law, especially not 8 years after the fact with the accused already dead. But it was enough, Jeremiah believed, to stand before a territorial judge and demand the land be returned to its rightful owner, or, at the very least to shame, whoever now held it into a fair settlement. He rode into Prairie Rose on a warm afternoon in late April, his horse dusty from the trail, his jaw set with the particular grimness of a man who has rehearsed a confrontation in his mind so many times that the real thing feels almost like a formality. He found Sheriff Bannister in the small office at the edge of town and laid his satchel of papers on the desk without preamble. "I am here to reclaim my father's land," he said. "The Wainwright place, 4 miles north along the river." Bannister studied him for a long moment, taking in the weathered face, the calloused hands, the eyes that held more sorrow than anger despite the hard set of his mouth. "You would be Jeremiah Turner, then. I wondered if you would ever come back. You know who I am." "I know the story," Bannister said. "Half this territory knows the story, Mr. Turner, though few will say it aloud with Wainwright cold in the ground only a fortnight now. But I will tell you plainly, because I think you are a man who prefers plain talk. The woman living on that land did not steal it from you. She is Wainwright's widow, and from everything I have seen these past 3 years, she knew little enough of her husband's dealings and profited less than you might imagine from whatever wrong was done to your family." Jeremiah's jaw tightened. "The land is still stolen, Sheriff, whether she pulled the trigger or not." "I am not asking you to forget that," Bannister said. I am asking you to remember there is a woman out there alone, with no family, no money to speak of, and a debt at the bank that will see her thrown off that land within the year regardless of what you decide to do about the deed. If you ride out there looking for a fight, you may win it and gain nothing but another family ruined on that same ground. Seems to me a man who lost everything to greed and cruelty might want something better than that for whoever comes after." Jeremiah said nothing for a long moment, turning his hat over in his hands. He had imagined many things about this return, but he had not imagined a widow, alone, already teetering on the edge of ruin. It complicated the clean anger he had carried for 8 years, and he did not like how it complicated it. "I will ride out there tomorrow," he said finally. "I mean to see the deed for myself, and I mean to see the land. What happens after that I cannot say yet." He spent that night at the small hotel in Prairie Rose and slept poorly, his mind circling old memories, his father's hands shaking as he signed papers he did not fully understand, his mother's silent weeping in the back of the wagon as they drove east, the particular ache of watching a home disappear behind a rise of prairie grass, knowing he would likely never see it again. He had been wrong about that last part, at least. Tomorrow he would see it again. He did not know yet what else he would find there. Harriet was in the garden behind the house when she heard the horse approaching, and something in the unhurried, deliberate rhythm of its hoofbeats told her before she even turned that this was not one of her 2 remaining ranch hands, nor was it Sheriff Bannister come to check on her as he had twice since the burial. She straightened, wiped her hands on her apron, and turned to see a tall man on a bay gelding reining up at the edge of the yard, his hat shadowing eyes that were fixed on the house with an intensity that made her heart beat faster, though not, she realized, entirely from fear. He was perhaps 30 years old, with a weathered strength to his face that spoke of years spent under open sky, and there was something in the set of his shoulders, some old grief carried like a weight he had long since learned to bear without complaint, that struck her even before he spoke. "Mrs. Wainwright," he said, dismounting slowly, "my name is Jeremiah Turner. I expect Sheriff Bannister has told you why I am here." Harriet's chin lifted, an old habit from years of learning not to show fear to men who might mistake it for weakness. "He told me your family once owned this land, Mr. Turner, and that you believe my husband stole it from you." "I do not believe it," Jeremiah said. "I know it. I have witnesses and bank records that will hold up before any judge in the territory. Your husband financed the ruin of my father through hired men and a false buyer, and when it was done, he built this house on the ashes of everything my family worked for." His voice was hard, but she noticed he did not raise it, did not step closer than was proper, and there was something almost like reluctance in the way the accusation left him, as though he took no pleasure in delivering it to a woman standing alone in a garden with dirt still on her hands. "I did not know," Harriet said, and she found herself repeating the words she had said to the sheriff, because they were the only true words she had. "I married Silas 5 years ago in Cheyenne, before we ever came to this land. I did not ask where his money came from, Mr. Turner, because I had learned by then that some questions did not have answers a wife wanted to hear. If what you say is true, then I am sorrier than I can tell you, and sorrier still that I have nothing to offer you by way of making it right, except to tell you that I intend to stay here and work this ground, because I have nowhere else in this world to go." Jeremiah studied her for a long moment, and Harriet held his gaze though it cost her something to do it, some old instinct urging her to look away, to soften, to apologize more than the situation required. She was tired, she realized, of apologizing for things she had not done, of shrinking to make herself smaller in the eyes of men who thought a woman's place was to accept whatever verdict was handed down to her. Whatever Silas had done, she had buried a child on this ground, had risen before dawn for 5 years to milk cows and mend fences and coax a garden out of stubborn soil, and she would not be talked out of the only home she had left without a fight. "I mean to have the land back," Jeremiah said finally. "That has not changed since I rode in this morning. But I did not ride 8 years and 400 miles to put a widow out on the prairie with nothing, whatever her husband did. I will take this to the territorial courts, Mrs. Wainwright, and let the law decide what is fair. In the meantime, I expect you had best keep working this ground, because from what the sheriff tells me, there is a debt at the bank that will see you off it long before any judge rules on my claim." "You know about the debt. Bannister mentioned it," Jeremiah said. "Horace Dunmore holds the note, I understand." "That man would foreclose on his own mother if it turned him a profit." A ghost of something almost like sympathy crossed his face, quickly suppressed. "I will not lie to you and say I wish you well here, Mrs. Wainwright, on ground that ought to belong to me. But I do not wish Dunmore well either, and it seems to me the two of us have that much in common at least." He mounted his horse then, touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was neither friendly nor hostile, simply correct, and rode back the way he had come, leaving Harriet standing in the garden with her heart pounding and her mind spinning with the sudden, unwelcome knowledge that everything she had built these past 5 years stood on ground far more contested than she had ever imagined. The trouble with Horace Dunmore arrived in full only 3 days later, when Harriet rode into Prairie Rose to settle what accounts she could, and found a notice posted on the bank's door announcing that certain properties along the Sweetwater River would be subject to foreclosure proceedings within 60 days, should outstanding debts not be satisfied in full. Her name was on the list, along with the exact figure Silas had owed, a sum so large it made her stomach clench with a fear sharper than any she had felt since the sheriff had ridden into her yard with her husband's body. Dunmore himself received her in his office with the particular oily courtesy of a man who has long since learned that cruelty is more effective when delivered with a smile. He was perhaps 50, soft-handed and well-fed in a territory where most men were lean from work and weather, and he steepled his fingers on the desk as Harriet explained that she needed more time, that the cattle would fetch a good price in the fall, that she only needed the season to set things right. "Mrs. Wainwright," he said, in a tone that suggested infinite patience wearing thin, "your late husband borrowed against that land not once but 3 times, and I regret to say the payments have been in arrears since before his unfortunate demise. I have been more than generous in my forbearance, out of respect for your circumstances, but a bank cannot run on generosity alone. Unless the debt is satisfied or a suitable arrangement made, I will have no choice but to take possession of the property in 60 days' time." "What sort of arrangement?" Harriet asked, though something in his expression already told her she would not like the answer. Dunmore's smile widened slightly. "I have long admired that stretch of river bottom, Mrs. Wainwright. Prime grazing land, and the water rights alone are worth a considerable sum. Perhaps, given time, we might discuss an arrangement that would see the debt forgiven entirely, in exchange for a partnership of sorts. A woman alone has few enough prospects in this territory after all, and I am not without means to make your situation considerably more comfortable." Harriet understood the offer beneath the offer well enough, and felt her face flush with a mixture of humiliation and anger that she fought to keep from her voice. "I will find another way to satisfy the debt, Mr. Dunmore. I would sooner lose the land outright than accept the sort of arrangement you are suggesting." "As you wish," Dunmore said, unbothered, already reaching for the next paper on his desk. 60 days, Mrs. Wainwright. The offer, of course, remains open should you reconsider." She left the bank with her hands shaking, not from fear alone, but from a fury she had rarely allowed herself to feel in 5 years of careful, quiet marriage to a man who had never once raised his voice to her, but had also never once told her the truth about anything that mattered. She was still standing on the boardwalk outside the bank, gathering herself before the ride home, when she became aware of Jeremiah Turner watching her from across the street, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. He crossed to her, unhurried, and though her pride told her to walk away, some other instinct kept her rooted to the spot. "You look like a woman who has just had a very unpleasant conversation," he said. "Dunmore means to take the ranch in 60 days, she said, before she could stop herself. "Unless I satisfy a debt I did not know existed until my husband was already dead, or unless I accept an arrangement I would rather starve than agree to." Something hardened in Jeremiah's face at that, though it was not directed at her. "I know the sort of arrangement Dunmore offers women in your position. I have seen it before in other towns." He was quiet for a moment, studying her with an expression she could not quite name, something between calculation and reluctant respect. 60 days is not much time to raise that kind of money from cattle alone, even in a good season. "I am aware of that, Mr. Turner," Harriet said, more sharply than she intended, exhaustion and fear making her tongue quicker than her manners. "I do not need you to remind me of my own troubles. If you have come to gloat over the notion that I might lose the land to the bank rather than to your lawyers, you may save your breath." To her surprise, something almost like a smile touched the corner of his mouth, there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "I have not come to gloat, Mrs. Wainwright. I have come to think that perhaps you and I want the same thing, even if we came to want it by very different roads." "And what is that?" "To see Horace Dunmore fail to get his hands on that land," Jeremiah said. "Whatever the courts eventually decide about the deed, I would rather see it settled between honest people than handed over to a man who has spent 20 years squeezing every homesteader and rancher in this territory dry. I have some experience raising cattle, Mrs. Wainwright, and I have some money saved from 8 years of hard work. It occurs to me that if the two of us worked that ground together through the summer, we might raise enough from the herd to satisfy the debt, and settle the question of ownership after, when neither of us is doing it with a gun to our head, so to speak." Harriet stared at him, searching his face for the trick she felt certain must be hidden somewhere in the offer. "Why would you help me keep the very land you came here to take from me?" Jeremiah was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its hardness. "Because my father spent the last 2 winters of his life believing the world owed him nothing but cruelty, and it broke something in him that never mended before he died. I do not know you well enough yet to say whether you deserve better than that, Mrs. Wainwright, but I know that watching another person get ground down by a man like Dunmore, on the same land where my own family was ruined, would not sit easy with me. Call it selfish, if you like. I would rather settle this dispute like something resembling honest people than see us both lose it to a banker's greed." It was not romantic, not yet, not even particularly warm, but it was an offer of partnership from the last man on earth she had expected to make one, and Harriet found herself nodding before she had fully decided to accept. "Very well, Mr. Turner," she said. "Ride out tomorrow and we will see what can be done." The weeks that followed tested both of them in ways neither had fully anticipated. Jeremiah moved into the small bunkhouse that had once housed Silas's hired men, most of whom had drifted off after their employer's death, rather than work for a widow with an uncertain future. Only one hand remained, an older cowboy named Amos Reed who had known Silas's business better than most and said little about it, and a young man named Charlie Prout who was mostly good for mending fences and had a talent for gentling horses. Jeremiah rose before dawn each morning, worked cattle alongside Amos and Charlie through the long hot days, and returned each evening dusty and silent to the bunkhouse, speaking to Harriet only of matters concerning the ranch. She, in turn, kept to the house and the garden, cooked meals for the men though it went unspoken, whether this was expected of her or simply a habit she could not break, and found herself watching Jeremiah Turner across the yard more often than she cared to admit, studying the quiet economy of his movements, the gentleness he showed the horses despite the hardness he had shown her that first day, the way he sometimes stood at dusk looking out over the river with an expression of such old, unhealed sorrow that she found her own chest aching in sympathy despite everything. It was Amos Reed who first told her more of the Turner family's history, one evening while she brought supper out to the men. "Old Thomas Turner was a good man," he said, not looking at her directly, as though the words were meant for the air rather than for her ears specifically. "I worked a season for him, back before your husband came to the territory. He built this place up from nothing, him and his boy and a wife who could outwork most men I ever knew. Losing it near killed him. I always wondered, working for Silas all those years, whether I ought to have said something about what I suspected. Never did, though. A man needs his wages, and questions do not pay well in this territory." "You suspected Silas was behind it." Amos was quiet for a long moment. "I suspected a great many things about your husband, ma'am, that I never said aloud, for my own reasons and yours both. I am sorry for it now, watching that young man work himself half to death trying to save land that ought to already be his." Harriet said nothing, but the words settled into her like the earlier ones had, another stone added to the growing weight of understanding just how much she had not known, and how much of that ignorance, however unwitting, had cost people she had never even met. The first real thaw between Harriet and Jeremiah came nearly 3 weeks into their arrangement, on an evening when a sudden thunderstorm rolled down from the mountains and threatened to stampede the herd grazing in the low pasture near the river. Jeremiah and Amos had ridden out at the first crack of thunder, but Charlie had taken a fall from his horse 2 days before and was laid up with a strained shoulder, and so it was Harriet, without quite deciding to, who saddled her own mare and rode out into the gathering storm to help. She found Jeremiah on the far side of the herd, fighting to turn the lead cattle before the whole mass of them bolted for the river crossing in the dark, where the current ran high and dangerous after the spring melt. Lightning split the sky, and in its brief white light she saw his face, strained with effort and something like fear, not for himself but for the cattle that represented both their futures. "Turn them east," he shouted when he saw her, and she did not ask why or argue but simply obeyed, spurring her mare wide around the flank of the herd to press the leading cattle back from the river's edge. For the better part of an hour they worked in soaked, thunder-lit chaos, shouting instructions to each other over the storm, and by the time the herd finally settled into a nervous, milling huddle on the high ground away from the water, both of them were drenched to the skin and breathing hard, their horses lathered with effort. "You did not have to ride out in that," Jeremiah said, when they finally drew their horses close together to catch their breath, rain still falling steady around them though the worst of the thunder had passed. "It is my herd too, whatever else is uncertain between us," Harriet said. "I did not learn to sit idle in a house while others did the hard work, Mr. Turner, whatever you may think of a rancher's wife." Something shifted in his expression then, some grudging respect finally overtaking the wariness he had carried toward her since that first day in the garden. "No," he said slowly, "I do not suppose you did." He was quiet for a moment, water dripping from the brim of his hat. "I am obliged to you, Mrs. Wainwright, truly." "Harriet," she said, before she quite knew she meant to. "If we are going to spend the season fighting storms together, Mr. Turner, I believe we might dispense with the formality." A ghost of a smile crossed his face, the first she had seen from him that seemed entirely unguarded. "Jeremiah, then," he said. "Though I confess I did not expect, riding into this territory a month ago, that I would end up on a first-name footing with Silas Wainwright's widow. Nor did I expect to find myself grateful for the company of the man who came to take my home away from me," Harriet said, and there was no bitterness in it now, only a kind of wondering honesty. "The world arranges itself strangely sometimes, does it not?" "It does at that," Jeremiah agreed, and they rode back toward the house together through the thinning rain, not speaking further. But the silence between them had changed its texture entirely, and both of them felt it. Summer deepened over the Sweetwater country, and with it came a fragile but genuine partnership between Harriet and Jeremiah, forged in the daily labor of ranching. branding calves in the June heat, riding fence line to line searching for breaks, working together to dose sick cattle with the crude remedies available in the territory, and slowly, without either of them quite naming it, falling into an easy companionship that neither had expected, and both had come to treasure more than they were willing to admit aloud. Jeremiah taught her things her husband never had, patient in a way Silas had never been. How to read weather in the shape of clouds building over the mountains. How to gentle a spooked horse with nothing but a low voice and a steady hand. How to judge the health of a cow by the brightness of its eye and the condition of its coat. Harriet, in turn, found herself teaching him things too, though she had not thought of herself as having anything to teach. How to coax a stubborn garden into producing through a dry spell. How to keep accounts properly so that no banker could ever again claim a debt existed that had not been carefully recorded and understood. How to laugh again, something she noticed he did rarely and always seemed faintly surprised by when it happened. One evening in July, as they sat together on the porch after the men had retired to the bunkhouse, Jeremiah spoke for the first time of his sister, the one who had died of diphtheria the year before his family lost the land. Her name was Sarah, he said, looking out at the darkening hills rather than at Harriet. She was 12 years old. My mother never fully recovered from it, I think, and losing the land the following year only compounded the grief. I used to think, riding all those years trying to earn enough to come back and set things right, that if I could just reclaim what was stolen from us, it would somehow put things back the way they were before. I understand now that is not how grief works. The land will not bring Sarah back, or undo what my father suffered before he died. I am not certain some days what I am even fighting for anymore. Harriet was quiet for a moment, feeling the weight of his confession settle between them. I lost a child too, she said finally, the words coming harder than she expected, though she had never spoken of it to anyone but the small stone marker on the rise behind the house. A daughter, stillborn, 2 years into my marriage. Silas never spoke of her again after the burial, as though speaking her name might undo whatever comfort he took in pretending it had not happened. I go out to her grave most mornings still, though I have never told anyone that until now. Jeremiah turned to look at her then, and in the dim light from the house window she saw something in his expression that was not pity, which she would have resented, but a kind of fellow recognition, one grieving heart acknowledging another. What was her name? He asked quietly. I named her Grace, Harriet said, though Silas never called her anything at all. Her voice caught slightly. I have never told anyone that before either. Grace, Jeremiah repeated softly. That is a fine name. He was quiet for a moment. I would like to see where she is buried if you would show me. It seems to me that ground has as much claim to being sacred as anything else on this land, whoever holds the deed to it. The next morning, Harriet led him up the rise behind the house, to the small stone marker half hidden in prairie grass, and together they knelt and cleared away the weeds that had grown up around it. And Jeremiah, without being asked, said a few quiet words over the grave. The same words, Harriet realized with a start, that Sheriff Bannister had read over Silas's grave weeks before, though spoken now with a gentleness that felt entirely different in Jeremiah's voice. Walking back down toward the house afterward, their hands brushed together, and neither pulled away, and something unspoken passed between them in that small contact, an acknowledgment of feelings neither was yet ready to name aloud, but which both understood had taken root sometime in the long weeks of shared labor and shared grief. The trouble that nearly undid everything arrived in early August, in the form of a man Harriet had never met but whose name struck fear into both Amos Reed and Jeremiah the moment it was spoken. She was in the garden when the rider approached, a lean, hard-faced man on a tired horse, and something about the way he sat his saddle, loose and confident in a manner that suggested violence held in easy reserve, made her call out for Amos before the stranger had even reined up at the fence. Ezra Coombs, Amos said grimly, emerging from the barn with his hand resting near the pistol he wore for snakes and coyotes, but rarely had cause to use for anything more dangerous. "Rode with your husband, ma'am, back when the rustling was at its worst. I had hoped he would have moved on to easier pickings by now." Coombs dismounted slowly, his eyes moving over the ranch with an assessing coldness that made Harriet's skin crawl. "Mrs. Wainwright," he said, touching his hat with mock politeness, "I have come about some business your late husband left unfinished. There is a matter of certain funds he was holding for our mutual benefit, and certain cattle besides, that I believe are owed to me." "I know nothing of any business arrangement between you and my husband," Harriet said, keeping her voice steady though her heart was pounding. "Silas told me nothing of his dealings, and I have found nothing among his papers that would indicate any debt owed to you." Coombs smiled, an expression that did not reach his cold eyes. "That is unfortunate, ma'am, because I do not intend to leave this territory without what is owed me, one way or another. Your husband and I split the proceeds of a good deal of business over the years, business he kept hidden even from his own gang, if the rumors are true. Gold, mostly, buried somewhere on this ranch if I have heard correctly, along with a fair number of cattle wearing altered brands that ought by rights to be mine. I mean to search this property until I find what I am owed, Mrs. Wainwright, and I would prefer to do it without unpleasantness, but I am prepared for unpleasantness if it comes to that." It was Jeremiah who stepped forward then, having come from the north pasture at a hard gallop the moment Charlie Prout had ridden out to warn him of the stranger's arrival. He placed himself between Coombs and Harriet with a deliberateness that left no doubt as to his intentions. "You will not be searching anything on this property," Jeremiah said, his voice low and dangerous in a way Harriet had not heard from him before. "Whatever business you had with Silas Wainwright died with him. If you have a legal claim to make, you may take it to Sheriff Bannister in Prairie Rose. Otherwise, I suggest you ride on before this becomes the kind of unpleasantness you claim to wish to avoid." Coombs studied Jeremiah for a long moment, sizing him up with the calculating eye of a man who had survived a violent trade through careful assessment of odds. "And who might you be, to speak for the widow's land?" "Jeremiah Turner. This land belonged to my family before Wainwright and men like you helped steal it from us. I have as much stake in what happens here as anyone, and I am telling you plainly that you will find nothing here but trouble if you stay." Something flickered in Coombs's expression, a recalculation of the situation that did not entirely ease the tension in Harriet's chest. "Turner," he said slowly, "I remember that name. Wainwright spoke of it once when he had too much whiskey in him. Said the old man never even suspected who was really behind his ruin, right up until the day he died." He smiled again, colder this time. "Seems to me you have your own grievance against this land, Turner, same as I do. Perhaps we might come to an arrangement, you and I, that would leave the widow with rather less than she currently enjoys." "I want nothing to do with the likes of you," Jeremiah said, his voice hard as flint. "Whatever wrong was done to my family, I will settle it through the courts, not through theft and threats against a woman alone. Ride on, Coombs, while you still have the chance to do so unmolested." Coombs's hand drifted toward his pistol, and for a long, taut moment Harriet was certain violence was about to erupt in her own front yard. But Amos Reed had quietly circled around behind the barn during the exchange, and now leveled his own weapon from a position at Coombs's flank. And Charlie Prout appeared at the corner of the house with a shotgun that, while perhaps not entirely steady in his young hands, was nonetheless leveled with evident seriousness. Faced with 3 armed men rather than the single widow he had perhaps expected to find alone and defenseless, Coombs's calculation shifted visibly. "This is not finished," he said, backing toward his horse. "I will find what is owed me, Turner, one way or another, whether you wish it or not. If you return to this property," Jeremiah said, "I will not extend the same patience twice." They watched him ride off toward the horizon, and it was a long while before any of them relaxed enough to lower their weapons, Harriet's heart still hammering against her ribs with a fear that had only just begun to give way to a fierce, unexpected gratitude for the men who had stood between her and danger, without a second thought. That night, unable to sleep, she found Jeremiah sitting alone on the porch, his rifle across his knees, keeping watch though Amos had assured them Coombs was unlikely to attempt anything so soon after being turned away in front of witnesses. She brought him coffee and sat beside him in the cool darkness, the stars spread thick and bright overhead in the way they only seemed to be in the territory, far from any city's competing light. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for standing between us and that man." "You did not have to do that." Jeremiah was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the dark shape of the hills against the star-scattered sky. "I have thought a great deal these past months about what I wanted when I rode back into this territory," he said finally. "I wanted the land returned to my name, and I wanted, I think, some measure of justice for what my family suffered. I still want those things, Harriet. But somewhere along the way, watching you work this ground with more determination than most men I have known, watching you grieve a child you buried alone and keep going anyway, I found that I wanted something else besides. I find that I do not wish to see you harmed, on this land or anywhere else. That surprises me more than I can easily say." Harriet's breath caught, and she turned to look at him fully in the dim starlight. "Jeremiah," she said softly, "I have found myself wanting things too these past months that I did not expect to want again after Silas. I did not think I would ever again feel safe with a man or trust one enough to let him see the parts of me I keep hidden. But I trust you. I do not entirely understand how that came to be true, given how we began, but it is true nonetheless." He reached out then slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and took her hand in his calloused palm warm against hers in the cool night air. "I do not know what the courts will decide about this land," he said quietly. "I do not know if I have any right to ask what I am about to ask, given everything unresolved between us. But I find that I would like to court you properly, Harriet Wainwright, whatever the deed to this ground eventually says, and whatever anyone in Prairie Rose might think of a Turner courting a Wainwright's widow on the very land that divides our families." Harriet's eyes filled with tears she had not expected, grief and hope tangled together in a way that felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely bearable. "I would like that very much, Jeremiah," she said, and when he leaned toward her in the darkness, she met him halfway, and their first kiss was soft and searching and full of the particular tenderness of two people who had each survived more sorrow than they cared to name, finding in each other something neither had expected to find again. Ezra Coombs did not return that week, nor the next, and Harriet allowed herself to hope, cautiously, that the threat had passed. But Sheriff Bannister rode out in mid-August with news that shattered that fragile peace. Coombs had been seen in Prairie Rose asking questions about the ranch's finances, about Dunmore's foreclosure notice, and worse, meeting privately with the banker himself in circumstances that suggested some manner of alliance between two men who ought by rights to have had nothing in common beyond their mutual willingness to profit from Harriet's misfortune. "I do not know what they are planning," Bannister admitted, standing in Harriet's kitchen with his hat in his hands, "but I do not like the look of it. Dunmore stands to gain the land through foreclosure if you cannot satisfy the debt, and Coombs believes there is hidden money or cattle on this property that rightfully belong to him. It would not surprise me if the two of them have found a way to work toward the same end, whatever their separate motives." The 60-day deadline Dunmore had set was now less than 3 weeks away, and though the summer's careful ranching had built the herd back to a healthy size, Harriet and Jeremiah both knew that selling enough cattle to satisfy the debt in full before the autumn drive to the railhead would be difficult under the best of circumstances, and might prove impossible if Coombs and Dunmore were conspiring to create additional trouble. "We will need to drive a portion of the herd to Cheyenne ourselves," Jeremiah said that evening, poring over figures with Harriet at the kitchen table by lamplight, rather than waiting for the autumn buyers to come through Prairie Rose. "The prices will be better in the city, and we can settle the debt directly with a bank draft rather than trusting Dunmore to deal fairly with cattle he might undervalue on purpose, to force the foreclosure regardless. That is a hard drive for 4 people, Harriet said, even with Charlie's shoulder healed enough to help again. It is, Jeremiah agreed, but I do not see another way unless you are willing to accept Dunmore's original offer, which I do not believe you are. I would rather drive that herd to Cheyenne myself, alone, than accept anything from that man, Harriet said, with a fierceness that made Jeremiah smile despite the gravity of their situation. Then we drive them together, he said, and we will manage, whatever it costs us in blistered hands and sleepless nights. The drive to Cheyenne took 11 days, a cross-country that tested every skill Harriet had learned that summer and several she discovered only through necessity. Fording swollen creeks, holding the herd steady through a hailstorm that left welts on exposed skin, riding night watch in shifts with Jeremiah so exhausted by the 4th day that they spoke to each other in fragments, too tired for anything but the essential business of keeping several hundred head of cattle moving in the right direction. But there was a particular sweetness to the exhaustion too, a sense of shared purpose that bound Harriet and Jeremiah together more tightly than weeks of easier companionship might have managed. And by the time the spires of Cheyenne appeared on the horizon, something had settled between them that felt, to Harriet, very much like the foundation of a marriage, though neither had yet spoken the word aloud. The cattle sold well in Cheyenne, better than either of them had dared hope, the buyers there paying premium prices for well-fed, healthy stock in a year when many herds along the trail had suffered from a dry summer. Harriet stood in the small bank office in Cheyenne, watching the teller count out the funds that would satisfy Dunmore's debt in full, with a portion left over besides, and felt something in her chest unclench that had been tight with fear since the morning Sheriff Bannister had first ridden into her yard with news of both her husband's death and the threat to her home. "We did it," she said, turning to Jeremiah with tears standing in her eyes, unable to keep the wonder from her voice. "We actually did it." "We did," Jeremiah agreed, and the smile he gave her then was unguarded and full of a joy she had rarely seen on his face, the last of some old bitterness finally giving way to something lighter. "Harriet, I have been thinking, these past 11 days on the trail, about what comes next between us, once this debt is settled and Dunmore no longer has any hold over that land." "What have you been thinking?" she asked, though something in his expression already told her what was coming. "I have been thinking that the courts might take months yet to settle the question of the deed properly," he said. "And I have been thinking that I do not much care any more whose name is on that paper, so long as I am permitted to spend my life working that ground beside you. I love you, Harriet Wainwright." I did not expect to say those words to Silas Wainwright's widow when I rode into this territory, but I find I mean them more truly than I have meant anything in a very long time. "Would you consent to be my wife?" Harriet did not hesitate, the answer rising in her with a certainty that surprised her with its completeness. "Yes," she said, laughing through sudden tears. "Yes, Jeremiah Turner, I will marry you, and gladly." They rode back toward Prairie Rose 3 days later with the debt satisfied, a bank draft safely delivered to settle accounts with Dunmore, and an understanding between them that would need only a preacher and a little time to become a proper marriage. But trouble, they would discover, was not yet finished with them, for word travels fast in a small territory, and Ezra Coombs had not spent the intervening weeks idle. They arrived back at the ranch to find the house dark and Amos Reed waiting anxiously in the yard, his face grim in the lantern light. "Coombs came back 3 days past," he said without preamble. "Dunmore was with him, though I do not think Dunmore expected the sort of trouble Coombs was prepared to make. They tore up half the barn floor looking for whatever it is Coombs believes is hidden here, and when they found nothing, Coombs took it in his head that perhaps the 2 of you had already dug it up and carried it off. He said he would return, and that when he did not intend to leave empty-handed this time, whatever the cost. Is Charlie all right?" Harriet asked, fear for the young man momentarily overtaking her fear for herself. "He is fine, ma'am. hid himself in the root cellar when he saw them coming, and they never thought to look there. But I do not like the look of things. Coombs seemed a man who has decided he has nothing left to lose. Jeremiah's face had hardened into the grim expression Harriet had seen only once before, on the day Coombs first arrived at the ranch. "We will need to be ready for him," he said. "Amos, ride to Prairie Rose at first light and bring back Sheriff Bannister and anyone else willing to stand with us. I do not intend to let that man threaten Harriet again without consequence." Coombs returned 4 days later, in the gray light just before dawn, apparently believing he could catch the ranch unprepared. He had brought 2 other men with him this time, hard-faced strangers Harriet did not recognize, and together they rode into the yard with the clear intention of taking by force whatever they believed Silas had hidden on the property. But Sheriff Bannister had arrived the evening before with 2 deputies, and Jeremiah, Amos, and Charlie had spent the intervening days preparing as best they could. And when Coombs and his men rode into the yard, they found themselves facing not a lone widow and her small household but 6 armed men positioned with clear purpose around the buildings, the element of surprise entirely lost to them. "This is over, Coombs," Sheriff Bannister called out, stepping forward with his own weapon drawn but not yet raised. "There is nothing hidden on this property. I had the barn and house searched myself after your last visit at Mrs. Wainwright's request, and found nothing beyond what any honest ranch might contain. Whatever gold you believe Wainwright buried, if it ever existed at all, it is not here, and I expect if it existed, one of his other associates has long since found and spent it. You are wasting your time chasing a ghost and threatening good people in the process." Coombs sat his horse for a long, tense moment, clearly calculating his odds against 6 armed men rather than the household he had expected to find, and whatever violence had brought him this far seemed, in that calculation, to finally exhaust itself. "This territory is getting too civilized for my taste," he said finally, with a bitter attempt at humor that fooled no one. "Very well, Sheriff, I will trouble this ranch no further. But if I ever learn that gold surfaced after I left this ground, I will hold you all responsible for the deception." "There was no gold, Coombs," Jeremiah said. "Only a woman trying to rebuild a life, and men too greedy to leave her in peace to do it. Ride on and do not return." Coombs and his men wheeled their horses and rode off toward the horizon, and this time, watching them go, Harriet felt certain the threat had truly passed, the last dangerous echo of Silas's hidden life finally fading into the vast Wyoming distance. Horace Dunmore's schemes met a quieter but no less complete end. With the debt satisfied through the Cheyenne cattle sale, he had no legal grounds remaining to pursue foreclosure, and when word spread through Prairie Rose of his apparent alliance with a known cattle rustler, in an attempt to intimidate a widow off her land, the resulting scandal cost him a considerable measure of the respectability on which his banking business depended. Several ranchers who had previously banked with him quietly moved their accounts elsewhere, and within a year, Dunmore sold his interest in the bank and left the territory altogether, his ambitions toward the Sweetwater Ranch, and toward Harriet herself, permanently thwarted. The question of the deed itself was settled not in a territorial courtroom, as Jeremiah had once imagined it might be, but in the parlor of Sheriff Bannister's house one autumn evening, over coffee and considerably less rancor than either party might have expected 8 months before. Jeremiah's legal claim was sound, the evidence of Silas's fraud clear enough that any judge would likely have ruled in his favor, restoring the land to the Turner name outright and leaving Harriet with nothing. But by then, of course, there was no need for so stark a ruling. Jeremiah drew up new papers with the help of a Cheyenne lawyer, papers that would place the ranch in both their names once they were married, a joining of the Turner claim and Harriet's years of labor into a single deed that satisfied both the law and, more importantly, the deeper justice that both of them had come to feel the situation truly required. "It seems fitting," Jeremiah said, As they signed the papers together at Bannister's kitchen table, Harriet's hand steady in his, that the land my father lost to greed should be restored not through more grievance, but through something built in partnership. I think he would have liked that better than any court judgment, if he could have lived to see it. They were married in October, in the small church in Prairie Rose, with what felt to Harriet like half the territory in attendance, drawn by a story that had, by then, become something of a local legend. The cattle rustler's widow and the rightful heir to the very land he had stolen, brought together not by law but by love, standing side by side to rebuild what greed had once torn apart. Amos Reed gave Harriet away, since she had no father living to perform the office, and Charlie Prout, grinning ear to ear despite his still mending shoulder, served as Jeremiah's best man. Sheriff Bannister stood near the back of the small church, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, he was the first to call out his congratulations, loud enough to draw laughter from the assembled crowd. Jeremiah's mother, Ruth Turner, had traveled from Cheyenne for the wedding, a frail but sharp-eyed woman who studied Harriet carefully throughout the ceremony and the celebration that followed, and who took Harriet's hands in her own that evening with tears standing in her eyes. "My husband died believing that land was lost to us forever," she said. "I only wish he could have lived to see his son not only reclaim it, but find such happiness upon it besides. You have given this family something I feared we had lost for good, Harriet. Not just the ground beneath our feet, but the hope that good things might still come to us, even after such loss." "I did not do it alone," Harriet said, glancing toward Jeremiah, who stood laughing with Charlie and Amos across the room, looking younger and lighter than she had ever seen him. "Your son taught me that a person can rebuild almost anything, given enough patience and the right partner beside them." The years that followed were not without their hardships, as no life in the Wyoming Territory could ever entirely be, but they were hardships faced together, and that made all the difference. The winter of 1878 into 1879 brought heavy snows that tested the young couple's herd management skills to their limits, but they came through it with fewer losses than many neighboring ranches. Thanks to lessons Jeremiah had learned trapping in the bighorns and instincts Harriet had honed through years of hard-won ranching experience. The following spring, they expanded the herd further, purchasing additional breeding stock with the proceeds from a successful cattle drive, and began construction on a larger house to replace the one Silas had built, one designed together from the ground up rather than inherited from a troubled past. Their first child, a son, was born in the spring of 1880, and they named him Thomas, after Jeremiah's father, a choice that brought tears to Ruth Turner's eyes when she came to visit her new grandson. 2 years later, a daughter followed, whom they named Grace, in quiet honor of the child Harriet had lost and never forgotten, the small stone marker on the rise behind the house now tended by 2 people rather than one. Wildflowers laid there each spring by a family that understood grief, did not need to be hidden or buried, but could instead be carried forward gently into a life built on love rather than loss. Amos Reed stayed on with the ranch until his health failed him some years later, having become something like family himself, an uncle of sorts to young Thomas and Grace, full of stories about the old days that he told with increasing embellishment as the years passed, much to Jeremiah's amused exasperation and the children's delighted fascination. Charlie Prout eventually struck out on his own, taking up a homestead not far from Prairie Rose with a young woman he had courted for 2 years, though he remained close enough to visit often and never failed to help during branding season or a difficult calving. Sheriff Bannister remained a fixture in Prairie Rose for many years and became a close family friend, godfather to young Thomas and a frequent guest at the Turner table, where he would regale the children with somewhat sanitized versions of the story of how their parents had come together, always careful to leave out the more frightening details of Ezra Coombs's visits, though Thomas, growing older, eventually heard the full tale from Amos, and considered it the finest story he had ever known. Harriet often thought, in the quiet moments of her new life, standing on the porch of the house she and Jeremiah had built together, watching her children play in the yard where once she had stood alone facing a stranger's righteous anger, of how strangely the world had arranged itself to bring her here. She had come to this land as the wife of a man whose crimes she had not known and could not undo, a woman with no family and no prospects beyond the uncertain grace of a ranch built on stolen ground. She had feared in those first dark days after Silas's death that she would lose everything: her home, her security, perhaps even her sense of herself as someone capable of building a life worth living. Instead, she had found, in the very man who had every right to hate her, a partner whose love had helped her rebuild not just a ranch but her own understanding of what a marriage and a life could truly be. The land that Silas Wainwright had stolen through greed and cruelty had become, through Jeremiah Turner's grace and her own hard-won strength, something worth far more than its acres and its water rights. A home built on honesty, on shared labor, on grief acknowledged rather than buried, and on a love that had grown, against every reasonable expectation, from the wreckage of injustice into something whole and lasting. On summer evenings, Harriet and Jeremiah would often sit together on the porch after the children were asleep, watching the same Wyoming stars that had witnessed their first tentative words of love, and Jeremiah would sometimes reach for her hand in the darkness, just as he had that night after Ezra Coombs's first visit, and say quietly, "I never imagined, riding into this territory 8 years angry at the world, that I would find the best thing that ever happened to me on the very ground I meant to reclaim by force." "Nor did I imagine," Harriet would answer, leaning into his shoulder, "that the man who came to take everything from me would instead give me back a life worth living, and love enough to fill it twice over." And on the rise behind the house, beneath the old cottonwood tree, 2 graves stood side by side now instead of one, Silas Wainwright's marker weathered with the years, and the small stone that read simply Grace, tended each spring with wildflowers by a family that had learned, through hardship and grace both, that the past could be honored without being allowed to poison the future, and that even ground stolen through greed and cruelty could, given time and love enough, be transformed into something worthy of the word home. The ranch prospered in the years that followed, growing to become one of the most respected cattle operations along the Sweetwater, known throughout the territory not only for the quality of its herds, but for the fairness with which Jeremiah and Harriet Turner dealt with everyone who worked for them or did business with them. A stark contrast to the reputation the same ground had once carried under different ownership. When drought threatened neighboring ranches in the dry years of the mid-1880s, the Turners were among the first to offer aid, sharing water rights and grazing land with struggling neighbors in a manner that many said reflected a hard-learned understanding of just how much suffering could be caused by greed and just how much good could come from its opposite. Thomas and Grace grew up strong and capable, taught by their parents to ride and rope and manage a ranch, but taught also, perhaps more importantly, the story of how their home had come to be theirs, not through simple inheritance or conquest, but through a reckoning with old wrongs, a partnership built on honesty even when honesty was difficult, and a love that had proven strong enough to heal a wound that might otherwise have festered for another generation. Harriet Wainwright, who had become Harriet Turner in that small Prairie Rose church in October of 1878, lived out the rest of her long life on that same ground along the Sweetwater River, watching her children grow and eventually have children of their own, watching the territory itself grow and change around her, as railroads extended their reach and towns grew larger, and the wild open country of her youth slowly gave way to a more settled world. But she never forgot, and never let her children forget, the story of how their home had been built, on ground once stolen, rebuilt through partnership, and made whole at last through a love that neither she nor Jeremiah had expected to find, but which had proven in the end to be the truest and most lasting inheritance either of them could have hoped to leave behind.